I'd like to welcome everybody to another of American Nuclear Society's webinars put on by the Risk-Informed Performance-Based Principles and Policy Committee, RP3C. My name is Prasad Kadambi and I'm chair of RP3C. The purpose of RP3C is to help modernize ANS standards. Modernization has come to mean that risk-informed and performance-based methods are employed to overcome the difficulties that we all know about with purely deterministic and prescriptive methods. We've been calling these methods RIPB approaches for short. The Nuclear Energy Innovation and Modernization Act specifically calls out use of RIPB approaches. There is a lot of guidance available on RIPB approaches, but most people have not had reason to become familiar with the guidance because the conventional approaches still dominate most things that we do, including standards development. Right now, ANS can be considered as a knowledge center for RIPB information. RP3C initiated these community of practice webinars on RIPB to enable practitioners of these approaches to share their knowledge and experience. Today, I'm very pleased to have someone from EPRI, Dan Moneghan, to give us a presentation on a topic of great interest and something we have not had as part of our community of practice previously. Dan is the second person from EPRI to participate in this program, and I hope there will be many more. So with that, I'll let Dan introduce himself and make his presentation. Dan, please take it away.
Thank you. So it's good to meet and sort of see everybody. My name's Dan Moneghan. I am a part of the Advanced Nuclear Technology program at EPRI. We mostly focus on the development and maturation of all of the advanced reactor technologies. So to EPRI, this includes a whole lot of things. It's really every reactor design that goes beyond the current operating fleet in terms of coolants, so non-water cooled reactors are advanced reactors. In terms of deployment methods, so small modular light water reactors are advanced reactors, or really anything that's a meaningful deviation from how we typically would consider an operating nuclear reactor, so micro reactors, dramatically smaller. All of this really is in the confines of the advanced reactor or advanced nuclear technology program. I am specifically responsible for a lot of our research on the advanced reactor designs and fuel cycles, which is sort of the perspective I'm going to be bringing to this community of practice today. I am not an expert on risk-informed performance-based licensing, but I have had a fantastic time learning a whole bunch about it as I've been preparing for this to really show where the value of those approaches are for the kinds of technologies I am more familiar with. So to give you a brief overview of what we're going to talk about, it's going to be the value of a risk-informed performance-based approach, sort of compared and contrasted against a more prescriptive approach to the fuel qualification process. And I'm going to talk through a whole bunch of different attributes of what actually goes into fuel qualification, what could go into a risk-informed performance-based version of this, and then talk about the specific things that we really need to look into and understand better as we're applying this kind of a methodology to a liquid-fueled, specifically molten salt reactor system. But in general, consider that most of what I'm going to talk about is applicable to any liquid-fueled system. We usually talk about this in the context of salt reactors, but you can dissolve your fuel in a metal just as easily as you can in a salt. And in theory, you could even do this in gaseous form, but that'd be a pretty challenging endeavor. So let's get started. The first thing I want to briefly touch on is what the fundamental safety functions are, because this is going to come up in a few different ways as we go through the fuel qualification process. Your fuel and the systems that it is involved with and entangled with are really going to have to do three things. They're going to have to limit the release of radiologic material to the public. That's, the ultimate safety objective is to keep the public safe while we generate energy. They have to remove heat from the reactor and wastes. We need to make sure that as we're operating these heat generating power plants, that we are adequately matching the heat generation and keeping any sort of accident from occurring that could release radiologic. And then we want to be able to control reactivity. And this is really just making sure we can adjust and modulate the heat generation term such that we can adequately remove heat, such that we can adequately limit the release of radiologic material. So these are all interrelated safety functions. And now let's jump into fuel qualification with these three goals in mind. This is a graphic copied from New Reg 2246, which basically steps you through the different things that you need to consider and achieve in order to get to that very top left corner, G, fuel is qualified for use. We're not going to talk about everything in this, and I'm really only going to hit a few points at a high level. But for your reference, this is the figure that's going to be sort of in the background that we're stepping through. We're going to go from the right really to the left, because that's how you get from the data and modeling assumptions all the way to the point where you have a fuel that is considered acceptable for use in a reactor. So let's call those two out. The two assumptions that we're going to make in this discussion are about what the inputs to our process are. Now, in reality, there's a lot of work that's going to go into making sure that you are developing experiments that get you the data you need in the form you need with the uncertainties you want, of the pedigree you want. And there's a lot of ties between how you use that data to build a model that you then validate, because you're going to need both the data and the models to really be able to progress this process. We don't have time to go through every single possible experiment you could use to really develop all of this, and we're not going to try because that's not really where the value lies. But one thing that I want to point out is what typical experiments are done. Oftentimes, when you're trying to qualify fuel, what you're really trying to do is show how the fuel changes throughout the operation of a reactor system. In general, this means that you would expose the fuel element to a sustained or semi-sustained level of heat or a specific temperature, generally the operating temperature of the reactor, and a certain amount of neutrons. You're going to put it in an environment that is representative of the irradiation conditions in the reactor so that you can see how the fuel changes. Radiation induces various structural impacts on materials as they experience that radiation. Oftentimes, this leads to things like swelling. In a typical light water reactor, if you irradiate an oxide fuel pellet inside a metallic clad, you'll see that oxide fuel pellet swell. It can eventually contact the clad. And if it swells too far, it could even cause some fracture, perforation, or damage because it is expanding at a different rate than the metal that's also in that system. When you think about what this would look like for a liquid-fueled reactor, it's a little bit different. If you irradiate a fluid, you're not going to induce the same kind of internal stresses and strains that you would in a solid media. You're not going to be displacing atoms in a lattice. You're not going to necessarily be swelling the whole system in the same way that you would with a fuel pellet. So if your goal is to understand how the fuel evolves with the reactor conditions, the tool that we have used historically, this fuel irradiation campaign, may not even be the appropriate tool for the job, because the fluid itself doesn't necessarily have the same evolution in a radiation environment as we expect, and as is sort of built in to the way we qualify fuel, because we're not necessarily needing to qualify the fuel at this point. If the fuel doesn't change within the reactor in a way that impacts its ability to maintain a geometry, for instance, what are we actually doing? Well, we're trying to understand how the fuel performs in that environment, which is why there are some potential language changes that are proposed in a variety of different documents, and we'll get to that in a bit. But in general, think about the current prescriptive or deterministic approach as a way to qualify a fuel for use in a reactor, and the risk-informed and performance-based potential alternative more as a way to characterize the performance of that fuel and the systems it interacts with to satisfy what those fundamental safety functions want. Or in another way, we really want to make sure that the fuel we put into our reactor is able to accomplish the performance objectives that those fundamental safety functions expect. So with that in mind, we're going to assume that we have data, and we're going to, just pretend here. And we're going to assume that we have good models. And again, we're sort of pretending here. But let's take those assumptions and walk through the process and see how a prescriptive versus a risk-informed performance-based approach may vary at different steps in this fuel qualification process. So starting from the data, we use that data to show that there are conservatively defined barrier degradation criteria in radionuclide retention. Now, these barriers can be any number of things. They can be actual physical structures. They can be feedback control mechanisms. They can be systems or subsystems. There's a lot of different things that could be a barrier here. But for the most part, let's look at these from the perspective of solid barriers because, again, time constrained and we're simplifying a little bit here. Now, if you think about the solid barriers that are going to exist, that are really trying to keep this system together, they can degrade a bunch of different ways. There are thermal stresses, there are corrosivity effects, there are erosivity effects, there are radiation impacts. Now, radionuclide retention works in a few different ways. In a liquid-fueled system, many of those radionuclides are going to be soluble. They're going to be suspended or dissolved in that fluid. They'll be in trained particles. They'll be sitting in this flow somewhere. But those aren't the only kinds of things we'll have. There's also, in addition to solid particulate fission products, you end up with fission product gases that evolve through operation. And while there's a certain solubility level of these in most of these fluids, they can still eventually bubble out and come out of solution. So there's going to be some sort of a gas gap over top that's going to have a sort of a different profile of those radionuclides. And the way those barriers are going to be stressed are, again, going to be a bit different because you have different kinds of radionuclides causing different impacts within the fluid against the structural walls of whatever you're containing this within, and in different phases. So you're going to have sort of a different approach to how these barriers retain and degrade over time. So with our models and data, well, what can we say about this? Can we define conservative barriers? If we have enough data, we know how each of these different kinds of radionuclides and each of these different kinds of operating parameters, the temperature, the pressure, the neutron flux that you see, we can effectively point to how they're going to stress a given system. It'll vary based on the temperature, based on the pressure, based on the material, based on the thickness, based on all sorts of factors, but we could point to it. That being said, if you write this out prescriptively, you're going to end up with conservatisms that are fairly broad, and they'll end up based on whatever the highest uncertainties are in the data you use to develop them when the regulation is written. If instead you chose a risk-informed performance-based approach, you might end up with something that looks similar at first. You might end up with relatively conservative estimates based on those uncertainties, but they'll vary a bit throughout the system. It's possible you have more or less uncertainty on data sets in different areas. And as a result, the associated conservatism might change in scale and change in size. If you understand specific aspects of the design better, you can build in a little less conservatism. You can build in smaller margins. And importantly, there is no prescriptive definition at that point. So as you move to your second, your third, your fourth reactor that you're going to try and license with this process, you can improve your data quality. You can reduce your uncertainties. And as a result, the conservatism that you've built in can scale. And that sounds like an advantage to me. That conservatism really trickles up into margin, because you need to define what the margin to your radionuclide release is under a variety of different accident sequences and conditions. And this is important to be able to get to that first of those fundamental safety functions. We need to protect the public. We need to limit the release of radionuclides. As you're defining these barriers, again, if you do it prescriptively, that margin is going to be built in. That's going to sort of be defined based on whatever occurred in the data when the regulation was developed. If you do this in a risk-informed, performance-based way, well, there's even potentially some further benefits to just having sort of local conservatism and local margins. Because in a liquid-fueled system, a accident sequence can evolve that doesn't necessarily work in the same way as it would in a traditional nuclear reactor or a traditional solid fueled system. There are some quirks, as there are with every reactor design, to a liquid fueled system. In the case of a liquid salt, for instance, there can be an overcooling accident sequence. If you get your temperatures down too much, or you remove too much heat, or something goes wrong, you can solidify your whole primary system. And that's not an accident sequence that is, remotely achievable in, let's say, a pressurized water reactor. So the fact that you have these sort of more flexible and sometimes quirky accident sequences that you want to consider means that the barriers that are impacted by these accident sequences may be different in different circumstances. So the ability to adjust where that margin is, depending on both the location of the margin in the design, as well as the accident sequence being accounted for by the margin, gives you, again, another step further flexibility compared to a broad strokes sort of universally defined margin based on a more prescriptive approach. So this does come with some challenges, of course. While you have more flexibility in a risk-informed, performance-based way, you also take more burden on yourself as the one submitting the case to a regulator why this should be. If you choose a prescriptive approach, the regulator essentially tells you what you need to do. If you take a risk-informed, performance-based approach, the regulator says, well, you just need to make sure this is satisfied. And it's up to you to both figure out how to do it, create a plan that you can really explain, acquire the data you need to point to the basis for that plan, and then justify it. And while you can get as many numbers as you want to make everything as quantitative as possible, there can still be some subjectivity to whether or not that is satisfactory. So while there's a lot more flexibility in a risk-informed, performance-based approach, there's technically, potentially some more risk that could be included on the part of the success. So let's step back to another assumption. Let's go with our models this time. What is the model trying to do here? Well, the model needs to show that you can ensure a coolable geometry and that you can demonstrate the insertion of negative reactivity. Now, that first one is a bit questionable. How do we ensure coolable geometry in a fuel where the geometry is a sloshy Newtonian fluid? We pump it. Is having a pumpable fluid geometry? Are we ensuring the geometry that way? Well, I'm not sure. That kind of depends on who's listening to this discussion. But what I could tell you is that for a liquid fuel, you can ensure that the heat generated by the fissioning and the decay of fission products is able to be extracted based on the characteristics of the primary system. So that we could do. So if we can't ensure coolable geometry necessarily based on the wording, but we can satisfy the objective that this is pointing to, which allows us to accomplish the fundamental safety function, maybe there isn't a great way to get through this particular step in fuel qualification with a liquid-fueled system. But on the other hand, there is a pretty convenient way, and even not necessarily a complicated way, to show that you can do it in a risk-informed, performance-based way, satisfying the performance objectives of the fundamental safety functions. So potentially this is, a point in favor of the risk-informed performance-based approach, while the others are sort of a bit more flexibility that comes with a downside. This one might actually not be possible prescriptively, but it would be possible in a RIPB approach. Now, with negative reactivity insertion, this one's relatively straightforward. You can use control rods, control drums. You can remove fuel salt and insert clean salt. You can remove fissile fluid and insert clean fluid. And there's ways of accomplishing this one. So G2.3.2 seems like it's not too much of a deal breaker in either direction. So from here, let's move on. What's the point of these two? Well, what you're trying to do is show that you have the ability to achieve and maintain safe shutdown. Prescriptively, this has a very precise definition. In a prescriptive approach, safe shutdown is when reactivity control systems must maintain a subcritical condition of the core, and residual heat systems must operate to maintain adequate cooling of the core. That's a safe shutdown, according to the NRC. This is something that is, very realistic and reasonable when you're looking at a light water reactor system. But it's a little more difficult and not necessarily the best working definition if we consider a liquid-fueled system. Let's take a molten salt system here, for instance. In a liquid-fueled molten salt reactor, you can have a safe shutdown configuration. And in this case, safe shutdown is a configuration where there is no possibility of an excursion, really, where you would go to a point where any of the fundamental safety functions are stressed. So you're retaining radionuclides, you are cooling any decay heat or fission heat that exists, and you are showing that there is sufficient reactivity control. There can be configurations like that where there is not necessarily subcriticality maintained in getting to that configuration. Because of some of the different temperature coefficients of the salt fuel, as you cool down and downpower your reactor, you can come through different criticality oscillations. You can tick back and forth between subcritical and critical, but at no point could you lose control of that system if you approach this correctly. So maybe you can't necessarily prescriptively satisfy safe shutdown, but if the intent is to limit the release of radiologic material, ensure you have sufficient cooling, and ensure that reactivity does not get out of hand, well, you could do that in a risk-informed performance-based way with some of these different approaches. In the case of the salt reactor, dumping the entire core volume to a series of drain tanks is what the molten salt reactor experiment did as a way to just sort of vent the core, get it out of a critical and operating state, and put it into a shutdown condition that is controlled and monitored. It was not operating when it was drained into those tanks, but it also didn't necessarily maintain subcriticality the whole way down. So this seems like another possible place where prescriptively the liquid-fueled system, in this case specifically a salt system, can't necessarily satisfy the letter of the regulation. But in a risk-informed performance-based way, it probably can. So what does that lead us to? Well, that leads you to a choice. You could potentially define all of this in a prescriptive or deterministic way, maybe requiring some rewrites like geometry or shutdown, but with enough data and with enough time to develop models, you could probably get to the point where this can be written prescriptively. If you do so, when that regulation is developed, it needs to be, or it will be done with conservatism and margins based on the highest uncertainty level in the data used to populate all of the regulation. So if the regulation is written in time for, let's say, the first reactor trying to go through this process, well, those margins might be pretty big. And that could be a large impact to your economic case if your margins are something that you're kind of concerned with, your economic margins in this case, not your safety margins. In a risk-informed performance-based way, you don't necessarily need all of the same data you would require to develop it in a prescriptive way. You probably want that data because it gives you benefits for your operability and other things. But as long as you have enough to show what it is you're going to do to actually ensure that you stay within a set envelope, what's going to matter then is the uncertainties that tie to a specific margin and what you can do with the operation of, let's say, that first of a kind system to shrink those uncertainties, to buy down your margin for your second unit. So you're no longer held captive to the quality of the science for your second unit that you were for your first unit. You can benefit from the improvements you get from operating a reactor for 5 years, for instance, or even just for going through the process and doing hot commissioning. If you sequence them close after each other, you could gain material economic benefit just by following the same process and paying attention and incorporating new data and new information into your licensing basis. So that's pretty interesting. Now, in either case, if you take the prescriptive approach with whatever conservatisms and margins they have, check all those boxes, well, your fuel is good. Qualified, again, maybe not the right word for it, but you could have fuel that's approved for use. If you follow the prescriptive approach, well, technically there's an asterisk here. You will have done everything that you think you need to. You will have collected the data, you will have developed the models, you will have developed an approach, you will have done a lot of testing, you will have shown, look at all these things we can do, we can satisfy all of these objectives of the safety functions. And if you don't, for instance, message that right, if you pitch it the wrong way, if you don't include pieces of data that you thought maybe were excessive for making your case, they don't have to say yes to your case. They can say, well, no, go back and get me this, that, or the other thing. You might even have it already. But there is inherent risk in the regulatory process. So again, in a prescriptive or deterministic framework, the impetus is on the regulator to make sure that what they're saying are requirements are very well developed. In the risk-informed performance-based approach, that onus is on you as the one developing the approach and bringing it to the regulator. So you may end up gaining benefit. You may end up being able to have more flexibility in margins. You may end up with the opportunity to buy down risk as you license, deploy, test, and learn for iterative units. But you are taking some of that risk on to yourself and your own practices. So there's benefits to both. But as I think we discussed, the couple of quirks about the letter of the regulation right now mean that I think risk-informed performance-based seems like the way you would want to approach this if you're looking to get a first-of-a-kind system with liquid fuel onto the grid or in a test configuration, depending on what you're after. But both approaches can work with sufficient data and with enough quality models. Now, all of this was assuming a whole lot of things. Let's talk about some of those things we were assuming. I'm going to be working primarily off of New Reg 7299, CR 7299. This is fuel qualification for molten salt reactors, which is sort of the culmination of a bunch of work that Holcomb, Poore, and Flanagan did through Oak Ridge National Lab for several years. But all of this is really tied together by the idea that characterizing the performance of your fuel is what matters the most, and that it's kind of complicated for these liquid fuel systems. So to reiterate, what we're doing is ensuring that the fuel in our reactor and the systems that it interacts with are able to satisfy the objectives of the fundamental safety functions, limiting the release of radiologic material, removing heat from the reactor and wastes, and controlling reactivity. Again, these are all very coupled systems. You control reactivity so that you don't have to overly stress heat removal so that you can guarantee that your radiologic material release is within the acceptable limits, which are extremely low for anyone who's listening and not familiar, extremely low limits. So what do you actually need to be able to show this? At the end of the day, you can only measure but so many things. In the new reg, Holcomb points out that, in theory, temperature and composition are the only two properties of a fuel salt that you necessarily need to know to be able to identify all of the other attributes that have direct impact on those fundamental safety functions. Now, what maybe are those? Heat generation. Well, this one's important for obvious reasons. You need to know how much heat's coming out of your fuel so that you know how much heat you have to be able to extract. Great. I mean, there's also other contributions like fission products and such, but we'll get to that. Reactivity, that matters a lot. Your reactivity still comes down to what your composition is and then sort of some of the operating practices, but that all builds up to temperature. Redox state, so you understand the chemistry, density, pressure, viscosity, and heat capacity, all this sort of gets to your ability to remove heat sufficiently. So a lot of these are all tied to those first two fundamental safety functions, but reactivity is obviously the third one on its own. Now, what's difficult is that all of these have some complexities and interdependencies. Your reactivity directly influences your composition. If you have higher reactivity, you might be inducing more fissions, which means the generation rate of a statistical distribution of different materials is going to occur. So the time evolution of your composition depends on your reactivity. The heat generation, well, this is dependent on the composition essentially directly, but the heat generation impacts your pressure, which will influence your viscosity. Your redox state also influences your viscosity because the way your system properties are going to interact with different materials in there. The redox state also influences density because this is going to control which pieces of the composition end up present. The density is going to impact your heat capacity. If you have more or less density, it's going to change the way the system itself has sort of thermal inertia. Now, these aren't even all that we have to worry about because heat transfer is the one that actually really impacts how our heat exchanger can remove that heat. And here's where you get a whole nother messy linkage of different properties. Your viscosity is both going to influence your velocity of your fluid in the system, as well as your heat transfer directly. Your heat transfer itself is actually going to impact your temperature, of course. Duh, that's what it does. But there's, even more complexity. Your corrosivity directly impacts your composition. Exactly, Jim. Lightning. So it's all kind of a mess. And there's lots of things that occur that influence these different parameters, not all of which are easily measurable. Now, what I've just described to you, maybe it's a bit complicated. That's also how all of this works in every reactor that's ever operated. So Dan, you might be saying, what's new here? What are you actually telling me? Well, I'm telling you that the time sensitivity of one property here to another is the issue. When people talk about liquid-fueled systems, they often talk about them being tightly coupled. All of these properties are tightly coupled. A very small time impact to one of these properties will cause ripple effects through most of them that will happen at a very short periodicity. When you want to ensure that your reactor is able to stay within a performance envelope, or your fuel to stay within a performance characterization envelope, you need to be able to measure it and actually determine if it's in that envelope. Now, our sensors can work pretty well, some of them, for some of these at some temperatures, not necessarily the ones we're after, but details. But even if all of our sensors worked fantastically and we could measure all of these things precisely, if we could only do it once every 30 seconds, that's probably not fast enough. So what we need to do is figure out a way in which we can not only define that performance envelope for the liquid fuel, the salt fuel, the metal fuel, whatever we have, but also develop a way of testing and sensing and detecting changes in the system that will tell us information we need to know on that essentially refresh rate that is going to let us verify with the precision we want that we are within the confines of that performance envelope, which, now that I put it that way, is maybe a bit more complicated than just the fact that variables have interdependencies. So how do we accomplish this? Well, For limiting the release of radiologic material, that first fundamental safety function, you'd probably look at using something like a defense in-depth approach. And there's a handful of places that have defined this: defense layers, defense lines. There's a lot of different terminology that goes into it. But the point is, a series of barriers, permeable, well, not permeable, semi-permeable or impermeable, are going to be required to show that if radionuclides start to emerge, they get stopped, stalled, slowed enough that by the time you get to that final barrier, whatever it happens to be, a feedback mechanism, a system, a subsystem, a piece of metal, that there is no radionuclide escaping to the public exceeding your release limits within the margin you've defined. Now, what are we actually trying to retain here? Well, what's radiologic in our system? You have uranium, you'll have plutonium evolving, you'll have americium, neptunium, and curium that are all fissionable, but there's also fission products. On the table on the left, I've got a whole bunch of the metallic fission products that will often evolve through operation of a salt reactor, let's say. But there's also going to be fission product gases, the xenons, kryptons, iodine, things like this. Now, for most of this, I'm just going to start talking about salt systems because we have a little bit better information through the molten salt reactor experiment on dissolved fuel and salts as opposed to metals. It all probably applies to metals too, just with different numbers and different solubilities. Point being, well, your liquid fuel is actually the first barrier you have. Your fuel salt is soluble to the fission products. It is implicitly chemically bound to the fissile and fissionable elements, and I mean, that's pretty good already. So if this is our first, let's call it a semi-permeable barrier, because as we just pointed out, things can change. Your fission product gases, well, they can bubble up to the top into the cover gas, or they can just be retained as bubbles within the fluid. But there's also going to be those solid ones. These might deposit out through thermal temperature difference-driven corrosion. They'll deposit into the cold leg. That's going to change where your radiologic material ends up being. So knowing where they are and knowing how they function is going to matter for which barriers matter, depending on the accident sequence you're considering. So ideally, to satisfy this, we would want to have perfect knowledge of every single atom of every single radiologic material everywhere in our system at all times, which is ridiculous to assume. But we can generally get there if we understand how the different phases of these materials transport through the media we're assuming. So how the gases move through the liquid, through the gas, and possibly through the solids, how the solids settle out of the liquid or are deposited or plated out, and really how the liquid flows and possibly leaches into cracks, voids, or pores. But in general, well, that's kind of approachable. We can measure a lot of this stuff, and even if we can't have precise knowledge of every single piece of it, we can get a pretty good understanding of where these different phases move throughout the operation of your reactor. So what's the next one? Well, you need to remove your heat from both the reactor as well as the wastes. What are the heat sources then? Primarily, you have the fission of uranium and plutonium. In a fast spectrum system, you'll also have the fission of americium, neptunium, curium, or, all of the fissionable elements or isotopes will eventually get fissioned through whatever decay sequence gets them into a fissionable or fissile state. You also have some secondary heat generation contributors. These are primarily your gaseous fission products and whatever plated out, fallen out, deposited solid fission products you have. That means that heat generation through the core, well, it's going to move generally in a couple of directions. The first big way of removing heat from the core is, again, going to be that liquid fuel, that fuel salt in this case, because it's the primary heat transfer medium. It's going to fission in your active core region, and then it's going to flow over to a heat exchanger where it's going to dump as much heat as it can into your secondary before it carries into the tertiary, whatever your power conversion that you're trying to do is, or whatever you got going on. But that's only the primary way of removing the heat. There's also going to be heat generated in your cover gas. So I guess you're going to need some sort of way of managing the heat in that cover gas, a decay heat rejection system, for instance. But this is also going to be something you want to do because you're probably going to want to be pumping out and extracting that cover gas, cleaning it up, making sure it stays inert and isn't super heat generating. You're also going to have some way of removing some heat from the structural material, for instance, or from the piping material, because not only are you going to have fission products that may end up physically on those pipes, that's going to be generating heat. Technically, you can also form little eddy current pockets of higher concentrations of some of the fuel salts, and that might have little tiny pockets of heat scattered throughout the system, which will mean there's going to be localized heat differences. But you're also just going to have some radiative heat coming off of this very hot fuel salt that you've got contained within. So you're going to need to have a variety of systems that can mitigate this heat generation. So mostly your heat exchanger working as intended, a cover gas decay heat rejection system, and something that's going to manage that heat that's conveying directly into the piping system. But overall, well, that also seems pretty attainable. It's adding a couple of systems that may need some maturing, but we've got a pretty good idea of how to do most of that. And that brings us to the third one, which is really controlling reactivity. Well, how do we do that? Controlling neutrons can be done in three ways. You can induce fission in something, and that gets rid of a neutron, not necessarily in a way that's going to remove neutrons, though it adds neutrons. Okay, well, what else? In the case of a thermal spectrum reactor, I guess you can moderate neutrons. That's control, slow them down. Graphites, sometimes the fluid itself can act as a moderator or some other kind of moderating material. Sodium hydroxide, for instance, is one that's been pitched. But you can also absorb the neutrons, and that's really a way of getting them out of there. There are elements that can be in the liquid fuel that could also function as neutron absorbers. Plus, you could put in some burnable poisons if you wanted, I guess. So what are the reactivity control mechanisms we have access to? Well, you can just adjust the fuel liquid volume. If you bleed off some of your fissile material and you inject some clean material, you've reduced the reactivity, you've reduced the worth of that system. You can adjust the heat input or removal. Well, because of how strong the temperature coefficient of reactivity of these fuel salts is, specifically strongly negative, which is what we want, by increasing the temperature, you can drive down the reactivity. Now, this is where that safe shutdown thing comes in, because if you lower the temperature and bring it down to a solid state, you're actually increasing the reactivity. But that's why you also have options like a control rod or a drum, a typical neutron-absorbing boron-based material, so that you can mitigate some of these changes. So can we reasonably control reactivity? Well, yeah, that actually seems like the easiest one out of all three of these to satisfy. So where does that leave us? Well, a risk-informed, performance-based approach to the performance characterization of a liquid-fueled system seems like a pretty good near-term pathway if you want to get liquid fuel onto the market, if you want to get it into demonstration, if you want to be able to start collecting some of the data that can be used to improve the process. Further data is needed if you want to develop right-sized margins, because right now we have enough data to justify probably pretty conservative margins. But ideally, you want to be getting those margins as right-sized as possible to improve your economics. Also, if you really want to develop that deterministic approach, you could totally do that. It'd probably take some rulemaking or some changes, and it would probably take more data. But you could do it. And third, well, we probably need some improvements to modeling so that we can reflect the tight coupling of a lot of those properties in liquid fuels. And in this case, molten salt properties are one where we've seen a lot of work from the national labs over the years to try and identify some of these. But the more we can start to build out either a sort of a fundamentals model from temperature and composition that everything evolves from, or even just a kind of gross 12-dimensional matrix across all of those many parameters I discussed, so that you can say, if I'm here, here, and here, well, I can narrow down my region, and that gives me the bounds in the envelope. Either way, you're probably going to need a couple more improvements to modeling. But again, none of this is insurmountable, which is pretty good, given that we want to be starting to approach this process for liquid-fueled reactors in the coming years. Now, this is the end of my presentation, and I am going to jump straight into questions. We have one from Brian Grimes, who's asking about differences in interaction in fast versus thermal neutron spectrum. So for those of you who are less familiar with some of the distinctions here, when a neutron's born from fission, it's born at ballpark 2 mega electron volts. And if that unit doesn't mean anything to you, that's fine, it doesn't need to. When you operate a light water reactor today, you can only do that with thermal neutrons, which is a neutron slowed down, in this case by light water, H2O, to 0.025 electron volts, which again, arbitrary unit, doesn't really mean anything here. Point being, you need to reduce the speed of that neutron by many orders of magnitude. so that it is highly probable to induce a fission in uranium-235. Now, when you consider what you could do with a fast neutron, a neutron at the speed it's born, you can induce a whole lot more interesting interactions with some of the non-fissile elements in your fuel. If you recall, light water reactor fuel is enriched to about 5% uranium-235. The bulk of it is uranium-238, not fissile, but it is fissionable. With a fast neutron, you can essentially convert the U-238 into a material that will fission. So your probability of those fissions goes down, but the energetics of those fissions go up, and the amount of material you have in your fuel that can be fissioned also goes up. So you'll have more of these fission interactions. You'll also have some more different neutron capture interactions that will occur. So this is where you can kind of flex the properties of your system, and you can start to burn more of the americium, neptunium, curium, a lot of these different transuranic isotopes. But you can also go the other way and trade off more energy that you send to your power conversion system. Essentially, you can give up some of your thermal efficiency to increase the amount of fissile materials you're producing. This is sort of what people call a breeding configuration. Because you get more neutrons out of a fast fission, in addition to some higher energetics, you can keep your chain reaction going sort of one-to-one, but you can also create an additional fissile plutonium isotope. So as you operate, you can actually produce a bit more fuel than you've consumed. But again, you're trading some power for that. So there's some flexibility. The absorption, the scattering, all of these different nuclear interactions that a neutron will have vary based on the neutron speed. So pretty much every interaction that occurs in a light water reactor will also occur in a fast spectrum reactor, or a thermal neutron or a thermal reactor will do the same things that a fast reactor does. But the relative proportion of scattering versus absorption versus fission based on the material and based on the temperature, based on the neutron speed, are all going to look a little different. So that's where you get into some intense design specifics. But in general, that's kind of the distinction here between what's going to go on in a fast versus a thermal neutron environment. Are there any other questions? Happy to.
Dan, if I may, I'd like to just ask the question. So in terms of the overall size of a practical system between a thermal and a fast spectrum reactor, are there large differences, or are they relatively small, do you think?
I don't think the geometry is going to change too much. If you consider, so there are developers who are looking at making fast spectrum micro reactors, or reactors with a power output of like less than 50 megawatts electric, let's just define an arbitrary number here. But there are very small systems that can be fast. There are very small systems that can be thermal. The geometry differences for them are not enormous. Excuse me. You may have some variability, but we're talking like differences of some feet, maybe a couple of yards. It's not like there's going to be acreage difference between a thermal and a fast reactor of the same nameplate capacity in general. So there's going to be some changes, but that's as much driven by the coolant as by anything else, because that dictates your primary system pressure generally, which dictates component thickness and all sorts of things. So while fast versus thermal may have a small impact on the physical size of the system, it's definitely not the driving factor in what would change that.
Thank you. That answers the question. I guess I have one more question. How much of the information from the molten salt reactor experiment do you think, how far does that information go towards meeting the minimum amount of information you think to undertake, a full-fledged design process? Let's leave licensing out of it, but just, in order to design a system that a designer can have confidence will work as expected?
That's a good question. Depends on who you ask. There are some people in Denmark, I believe, who have taken the MSRE data as essentially good enough to embark on a full design pretty heavily based on that system. But there are people elsewhere who have said, well, this is good enough to be representative, but I don't necessarily want to assume all of that. One particular that, let's say, is that the molten salt reactor experiment operated with a pretty high composition or oxygen composition in the fuel salt, which I think by ballpark and order of magnitude exceeds what we would consider acceptable today. And their design decisions were based on the impacts that that much oxygen would have, which heavily influences the corrosivity. In fact, the corrosivity of a molten salt is, I think, predominantly driven by the oxygen concentration in that salt. So their design was based on assumptions that are well beyond the scope that we would consider reasonable today. So from one perspective, you could consider them to be very good and bounding. And from another perspective, you could say, well, they're so far removed from bounding that I'm not sure it's necessarily representative anymore. And I think that kind of depends on your approach to it and how much access you have to your own updated testing. If you can operate a molten salt loop and say, well, let me change that oxygen concentration and see if the difference would impact any of these other major design parameters, and you can confidently do that, well, then it's a great basis. If you don't necessarily have access to the same salt concentrations or compositions, but you still want to use it, well, then maybe at best it's informative and directional, but not necessarily something you would want to base a design on. So the answer is it depends.
Yeah, thank you. There's I think a comment or a question in the chat. Perhaps you can address it.
Yeah, comprehensive seminar to Gen 4 forum on taxonomy of MSRs, 15-minute march, core size comparison. All right, cool. So that is another resource to help answer your question. Out of curiosity, what does that one say? I don't actually think I've gotten to watch that seminar before. If someone who's seen it already. Perhaps
the commenter can give more information about this event.
I believe it's on the GIF Gen 4 webinar, and it's posted already, so you can actually see the recording and the slides.
Yep. And this is Cheyenne, by the way, the commenter. I'm looking at the slide now. We're at the 15-minute mark, and he, at least in a breed and burn open breed and burn cycle, he compares sodium uranium chloride fast, sodium uranium of a different composition, a uranium tri, and there's a couple of there's like a lithium fast. Basically, the sodium thorium is the largest core size. The lithium thorium fast is or not fast, thermal is the smallest, and the range here is anywhere from 14 cubic meters to 66.
Okay, so factor of 4 or so.
Well, thank you very much for sharing all that information, folks. Appreciate it. Let's see, are there any other questions? Because, I just want to say that you presented a whole lot of information, Dan. I really appreciate it. And I think, a lot of people have a much better understanding of the challenges and the opportunities with the fuel salt, molten salt reactor. And, if there are no other questions, I guess, I want to again, on behalf of ANS and RP3C, thank you for making the presentation and sharing all this, knowledge that you have acquired with us. So, Pat, I think that is it. And thank you very much for participating, everybody. And we'll let you know about the next community of practice event, shortly, I hope. So thanks again, Dan.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you.
Double thanks. You all have a great weekend. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.